During the Second World War, bombs were planned to be set off in Japan by using bats. The idea was to capture heaps and heaps of Mexican free-tailed bats which would carry explosives up to half an ounce. 1,000,000 such bomb-carrying bats were to be dropped from aeroplanes in the morning. Those nocturnal mammals would seek shelter in the darker regions of the mostly wooden houses of Japanese cities, setting off the explosives and causing a conflagration. Although this idea did not come into fruition due to bungled testing and other technical glitches, it is an example of how bats can, through technical intervention, wreak havoc. During the COVID-19 pandemic, which is being labeled to have originated in bat species, we've been shown how bats, possibly, can through natural means also cause devastation. The COVID-19 is a viral disease that falls in the category of coronaviruses, the notorious virus that has a crown-like structure. One of the reasons why bats are indicted to have caused COVID-19 pandemic is because the previous two coronavirus outbreaks are firmly believed to have spilt over from bats. An infected bat, which then affected civets, which are abundantly found in the Chinese markets, and finally found its way into human beings, has been confirmed to be the mechanism of transmission of SARS, while a spillage from a bat over to camels found in the Middle East region, which then transmitted it to people, is the most likely explanation to the emergence of MERS coronavirus epidemic in 2013. But how do you know that MERS, SARS and COVID-19 are so closely related in the first place? Well, through the study of their genome. Any living species has a complete set of the instructions of their genetic material, that is genome, being coded into their DNA, which are housed inside chromosomes, which are in turn cased inside cells. If you take a look at the DNA of any organism, it is a helical structure which has chained molecules, adenine chained to thymine and cytosine chained to guanine. The co-discoverer of the double helix model of the DNA, Francis Crick, once wonderfully put it that the two chains of DNA are like two lovers, held tightly together in an intimate embrace, but separable because however closely they are fit together, each has a unity stronger than the bond which unites them. Such a bonded pair is often referred to as a base pair, and there are billions of such base pairs in a sequence of the genome. Study of how such sequences are organized gives a clearer picture of the kinship between various animal species. If you match the genome sequence of cats, dogs, tigers, leopards and other animals of their ilk, they'll have a large overlapping portion of the genome, the non-overlapping portion giving a cue to the mutations and variation in those species. It is the same technique that allows us to map a common ancestry of humans, gorillas, baboons and other apes. As viruses are also made out of such genomic sequences of DNA or RNA, we can study the genome of viruses that led to MERS, SARS and COVID-19 outbreaks and trace them as a part of the same family. The study of such genomic sequences might also give us a cue as to why bats are so good at carrying viruses but are rarely affected by a voluminous number of deaths due to them. Bats have their interferon alpha gene, which is activated as a defense mechanism of the cells against any viral infection, turned on all the time, as opposed to mammals like humans, inside whom it triggers only when necessary. Besides, mammals also activate ribonuclease L, which chops up the viral RNA into various pieces as a protection against it. But activating ribonuclease L is a complex mechanism which takes a lot of time in all other animals except bats, who have the power to activate it almost within the snap of their fingers. The quick activation of these defense mechanisms in bats has its links to flight. Bats are the only mammalian species to fly, and flying takes an immense amount of energy. This means that the mitochondria of a cell of a bat is put into overdrive to break food into energy. But this hyperactivation of mitochondria produces a lot of oxygen, or in scientific terms, oxidative stress, and this leads to some damage in the DNA. The damage of a DNA triggers inflammation, which is the healing process of a DNA, but a high rupture of the DNA of the bats due to flying causes an overdrive of inflammation too. and too much inflammation in a body means too many white blood cells, which can cause cancer and other complications. So, the inflammation triggering mechanism of bats is lower than other mammalian species, and the bat is poised to survive with just enough DNA damage without setting on too much inflammation. But without inflammation, the viruses can attack bats' DNA easily, which is why the interferon production system and activation of ribonuclease L is constantly on high alert in bats to fight viruses. Despite the fear-mongering about bats being the biggest culprits of virus transmission in humans, it has not been proven conclusively that Covid-19 was a spillover from bats. Coronavirus such as SARS and MERS might have mutated into Covid-19 in intermediary animal species such as civets or pangolins before transmitting into humans. Besides, it is not impossible that a person who had developed antibodies to SARS or MERS might have been the patient zero inside whom Covid-19 mutated first. This is not the first time that bats have had a bad rapport for carrying viruses. In 2012 in Lebanon, around 5,000 of the 7,000 fruit bats in a cave were slaughtered, which has been linked to a study where fruit bats were discovered to have antibodies to a virus known as Marburg. Again, note that Marburg antibodies don't necessarily mean that bats developed the virus. It only indicates an exposure of bats to Marburg, just in the same way an asymptomatic COVID-19 human carrier has COVID-19 antibodies. Even earlier, during the 1940s and the decades that followed, the discovery of rabies in vampire bats has led to killing of millions of species of bats that are not even blood-feeding in regions such as Trinidad and Tobago, Brazil and Venezuela. The negative perception towards the bats might have something to do with the fact that they are active during the night time and thus awakening a general sense of fear. Besides, they also hang upside down in opposition with the erect posture that most mammals have. Even in Isaiah 2:20, bats are recognized as lowly, dark and unenlightened. In 1332, Lady Zacume of Bayonne in France was publicly burned because a crowd of bats was seen circling over her house and therefore was taken as a portentous omen, a sign of witchcraft. Such perceptions towards bats have changed in recent times due to heroic efforts of bat conservationists, and we're discovering the potential benefits of bats in our ecosystem. As many as 300 species of fruits depend on the pollination due to bats. Their importance to keep the population of insects at check can't be stressed enough. Researchers are trying to study the process of echolocation that bats use to navigate in the dark to provide navigational aids for blind people. With such excellent immune system that allows them to harbor viruses without even being affected in the slightest bit by them, the way forward to learning to manipulate our own immunity or developing vaccines to make sure that pandemics like COVID-19 don't hit us in the future might be a greater study of bats, not their obliteration.